Okay, cool. All right. So listen, it's always been difficult to be a Christian. Like right from the start, it was like built in. It was a feature, not a bug. If you read the book of Acts, you essentially end up with the day the church begins, almost the day the church begins, there's pushback from the Jewish leaders. There's persecution, there are arrests, there's hey, stop doing that. That inevitably kind of morphs and evolves into, killing people. We have our first martyr really early. With the Jewish leaders, that then morphs and evolves into driving Christians out of their home and sending them away. And it's just, right from the start, like it's always there when it comes to the Jewish leadership. And it doesn't take long within, I don't know, 25, 30 years or so before the Jewish leadership is kind of the last thing anybody has to worry about when it comes to persecution because Rome gets involved. It starts with a guy named Nero. Nero is the emperor at the time, and he has some misdeeds himself. He has some difficult political things going on in his world, and he needs a scapegoat. And here are these weirdo Christians who believe strange things and have these weird rites around, communion. I mean, communion from the outside looking in looks really weird because it's like, this is blood and this is a body. And the Romans, they weren't big on metaphor, and so they're like, why are you cannibals? And it was a whole thing. And so they were an easy target. Christians were an easy target. And so Nero ends up persecuting some people. And then about 30 years after that, you've got a guy by the name of Domitian. Domitian is, he seems to be at least a little bit more of an honest fella. Like he's not using Christians as a scapegoat. He just is sort of a true believer in Roman religion and in Roman the gods, and he's unhappy that other people aren't. And so Christianity ends up being persecuted that way. By the end of the first century, the apostles are all dead. Outside of John, John's the only one who doesn't die. A lot of other names, Stephen is another name that is really rather famous, and there's a few others. But it's never been easy. But I think what we need to understand is that it only gets harder. You see, in the first century, the persecutions were largely local. Meaning, it was if you live in one spot of the empire, if you live in, if you're in Jerusalem, if you are in, in just Rome proper, yes, great. It's hard to be a Christian, but there's a lot of places where you could live at peace, where you could live doing whatever, and nobody would care. Because at the end of the day, most Roman, Rome's a big place. The empire is a big place, and most Roman governors just want peace, and they just want to be left alone, and they just, they don't want the hassle of dealing with it. It's sort of like most cops don't want to write you a ticket. Like, that's why, like, you can drive, like, 73, and they're in the 70, they're not going to write you that. They don't care. It's too much paperwork for them, right? So, you got a little bit of a buffer there. Like, it's just a hassle. And so for a lot of the early leaders in Rome, they didn't really want to mess with it. But within a couple hundred years, things begin to escalate. And it started around 250 with an emperor by the name of Decius. Decius was like Domitian on steroids. Like he was a true believer. This was not a I hate Christians. It was I love the Roman gods. And he wanted everyone in the empire to worship the Roman gods. So that was the rule. Everybody had to do it. Everybody had to make their sacrifices. Everyone had to pray the prayers. Everybody had to do the stuff. And if you didn't, he would kill you. That was the penalty. Now, it's really important we understand that he didn't care what else you did. Like, the Romans have lots of gods. They have lots of deities. They have lots of different, things to worship and ideas to ascribe to. And so it wasn't like, don't be a Christian. It was just be a Christian, but also worship the Roman gods. The problem with that is somewhat obvious, though, if you're a Christian, right? Like, the bedrock of Christianity is there's one God. And anybody else who is claiming to be a god and any other deity that other people worship, we don't worship. Like, it's like rule number one. Like, we have basically, like, even like we're basically a religion with no rules, and yet that's sort of just assumed. Like, you don't worship other gods. And so it was essentially basically outlawing Christianity in 250 AD. And then 25, 30, 40 years later, depending on how exactly the records we look at, the basically gets dropped off, and Christianity just becomes completely illegal. That emperor was named Diocletian. And Diocletian was another true believer, but he was meaner and he was jealous-er. He was more jealous. That jealous-er isn't a word. But he was more jealous. Like, for him, it wasn't just, I want you to worship our gods. It was, I want you to worship our gods only. And so he actually, it wasn't targeted at Christianity, but it was targeted at every other religion in the empire. Everybody else was illegal. And so by the late third century, Christianity is full-on illegal all over the empire. To get baptized was to put a target on your back. It was basically to live either in secret or die. And I know that, like, death is death. At the end of the day, there is no good way to die, particularly. But I mean, the way that things happen got really ugly. So when I say ugly, like it was like this. So there's a really famous example of a guy who dies under Diocletian. And he was scourged, which is what they did to Jesus before he was crucified. Later after that, they poured salt and vinegar, like the potato chips, but into his wounds. That's not funny. Don't laugh at that. That wasn't a funny. I don't know why I'm making a joke about this, because I'm uncomfortable. That's why I'm making a joke. It's a terrible story. Buckle up. So scourge him, tons of wounds all over him, vinegar, salt all over him for the pain, and then they put him in water, which they slowly boiled until he cooked to death. That was how they killed people. So, like, it wasn't a clean, quick death where, this wasn't a martyrdom that, like, you could be proud of. This wasn't like, hey, I'll do it. I'll sign up. I'll show everybody how great my faith is. No, like, if your faith isn't as real gets, you are tapping out immediately with the pain these people were going through. And that was what life was like for Christianity at the end of the 3rd century. It is a wonder, frankly, that Christianity survives this. And I'm not totally sure, as an aside, I'm not totally sure how long we would have survived that. But at least for one person, this whole world was an opportunity. His name was Sebastian. And Sebastian was a different guy than maybe anybody. Sebastian was a different kind of a guy. Where everybody else saw that there was this giant barrier to faith, where everybody else saw this terrible persecution and this great tragedy, Sebastian saw like a canvas that he could paint a masterpiece on of rebellion and resistance and faith. Sebastian, we know very little about. We know until a certain point. We know he was French. We know he studied in Milan. Like, we know he went to Italy to study. And we know he became a Christian somewhere in here. And he decides, I need to do something. Whereas most people sort of looked at life and said, well, how can I survive the longest? Sebastian sort of looked at the world and said, okay, the writing's on the wall. I am not surviving. What can I do with the time I have? And he got crazy with it. In 283 AD, Sebastian joined the Roman military, which is all sort of bonkers in ways that I'm not sure we can properly and adequately understand. So let's just start here, okay? Christians at that time in history did not join the military at all. It's not a thing they did. Christians saw Jesus as being nonviolent, essentially. They saw Jesus as being someone who does not kill. And so for them, it was just a non-starter. You're not going to put a sword in my hand. You're not going to make me kill anybody. That was actually what made them very, very unpopular earlier in earlier centuries, because they were just this giant conundrum of, we don't kill. We're not going to do it. And that, of course, is not something the Romans want, because the Romans put a sword in everybody's hand and say, go spread the empire. And even if the Christians were to kill, like, even if it was like, okay, like, we, had this whole, even if they were to, like, work their way through this and say, okay, there are some circumstances in which I can kill, there are some circumstances in which I could join a military, they would never join the Roman one, because the Roman one was by definition unjust. They were spreading throughout the known world. They were subjugating people. They were enslaving people. They were terrorizing people. They were tyranny in a nation. And so you would never join. And yet Sebastian literally goes and volunteers and signs up for the military. But we're not close to done yet with the craziness. This was 283. Remember, Diocletian is the guy in charge, the salt and vinegar and the boiling Christian thing. Like, you know who did that to him? Roman soldiers. Roman soldiers were the ones who actually enforced the edict of Christianity being illegal, which means not only did Sebastian sign up for the military, but Sebastian signed up for the military that was literally killing his own people, which is a lot like if one day in, here in Missouri, you see like a group of hunters out and they're all wearing their orange and they've all got their guns, and one of them is a buck just on hind legs with hooves. I don't know how he pulls a trigger with hooves. But, like, just imagine, like, a buck being like, oh, yeah, it's deer season, let's go. Like, he's going to have to persecute Christians and be a good soldier. He's going to have to do it. If he's going to do his job well, he will end up persecuting and participating in killing Christians. That's crazy. Maybe the craziest part of all of it, though, is by joining the military, he's getting closest to sort of the eye of the storm, right? Like, now suddenly it's not like they're going to be like, oh no, like, Christianity is legal, but not Sebastian. We like that dude. It's not that. Like, if they find out he's a Christian, they're going to take it personally, more so than they're going to take anything else. They're going to think, the audacity of this guy to be a Christian and join us. He is going to be killed in an incredibly creative way. This decision in 283 for Sebastian to join the military makes absolutely no sense at all until you think about it from his perspective. Now remember, he has no ideas. Like, there's no part of his brain where he's thinking, I'm not going to die an old man, right? Like, I'm a Christian living under Diocletian. Like, they're going to get me at some point, right? So he figures, what can I do that would do the most dramatic amount of good? And because no Christians were in the military in his mind was the greatest mission field he could find. I mean, he might find Christians if he goes to the market. He might find Christians if he goes to, anywhere else in Rome. But you go to, the barracks of a Roman encampment of the soldiers, not a one of those guys is a Christian. So he figures, well, if I got 300 soldiers here with me, I got 300 people to share the gospel with. Sort of makes a little bit of sense. Furthermore, yes, okay, fine. The military absolutely is going to persecute Christians. They're going to punish Christians. They're going to, do the edict thing, all of that. But look, also, what better way to mess all that up but from the inside? I mean, he could just do his job really well until he doesn't. And then suddenly, I don't know, somehow Christians just get warned. And they escape before the military gets there. And I don't know, maybe they're just a little bit delayed. Just a little bit delayed. Something happens, He could mess things up from the inside and actually save lives that way, he figured. And I think the last part is maybe just the greatest genius of all. The sheer audacity to do this is something that no Roman would believe. No Roman would believe that anyone would do this. So if Sebastian's going to do it, no one would believe that somebody would be that stupid. Like, if you ever met somebody who's so dumb, it defies all reason and logic, and you just don't believe it. Like, no one's that dumb. There's got to be another explanation. No one's going to look for evidence that he's a Christian when he's standing next to the people who kill Christians, because no one's that dumb. Sebastian is banking on hiding in plain sight by doing the dumbest thing in the world that no one would even question, because he's just that dumb. So Sebastian joins the military. And for right about 3 years, his plan goes perfectly. After the fact, when this is all said and done, 16 people, soldiers, there's actually a government leader who comes forward at a certain point. 16 people come forward and say they became Christians through Sebastian's witnessing to them. 16 people in 3 years ain't bad. That's pretty good, especially when every single conversation gets you killed. And he did, in fact, like we don't have records exactly of how many lives he saved, but we do know, suspiciously, a lot of Christians outside, when it came for their part of the army, suddenly these people were gone. It's like they were warned, and it's like they were a little bit like one step behind, and somehow or other, they were really ineffective at persecuting Christians. I mean, everything went well for like 3 years. And then one day, it kind of went too well. You see, Sebastian was found that he was really good at some things, and soldiering was at the top of the list. He took to soldiering like Michael Jordan took to basketball. Just like he was just amazing at this. And so in 286, he got himself a job promotion, which ended up being essentially a death sentence. He was promoted to being a member of the Praetorian Guard, which is a fancy word for the guys who guard the emperor and his cabinet and family and everything. He rises to the highest ranking guard in the Roman military. I mean, there's like it's one thing to evangelize, in the trenches. It's one thing to kind of like muck up the works, there, but to try to pull that stuff when, you're in arm's length to the emperor, like that's just not going to work. And so surely Sebastian needed to stop, right? Yeah, Sebastian didn't stop. So there are these two guys, these two twins, Marcus and Marcellian were their names. And Marcus and Marcellian were a couple things. The number one, they were Christians. They were deacons in the local church. They were very important people in the church. But also, they came from a very important family. And so they didn't get killed immediately for being Christian. That's not what happened. They got arrested, put in prison, and basically the opportunity was given to the family to try to talk them into being good Romans again, because they were from a very important family, and that family could pull the strings, and this is the way the world has always worked. So Marcus and Marcellian are in this cell, and they're locked up. Day in and day out, Marcus and Marcellian's parents came and tried to talk to them and say, hey, listen, you don't want to die. There's no reason to die. All you got to do is, you can believe what you want to believe inside, but just do this outwardly and just, try to convince them not to die. And Sebastian sees this, and he says, well, those parents seem like people I should talk to about Jesus. And so day after day, they would come, and they would try to talk these deacons in the church out of being Christian. And Sebastian would talk them out of talking them out of being Christian. And when all is said and done, the good news is this. Marcus and Marcellian's parents became Christians, which is hilarious. But also, Sebastian was so brazen in what he was doing. He is a member of the Praetorian Guard, openly evangelizing to important families in prison, that he ends up getting caught by this. He figured it was a matter of time. But when he got caught, it wasn't just, a random governor or whatever who arrested him. He's a member of the Praetorian Guard. The person who arrested him and sentenced him was Diocletian himself, the emperor himself. So the emperor decides we need to make an example out of him. And so very simply, early one morning, he was tied naked to a pole at a practice range for the archers of the Roman army. And everyone was told, today, you have a new target to practice on. By the end of the day, one of the early accounts, the historical accounts of this, said that he looked less like a person and looked more like an urchin. If you don't know what an urchin is, go ahead and Google that. That's the state that he was in. And everyone just assumed he was dead because, he's got hundreds and hundreds of arrows inside of him. At the end of the day, then, they just leave him for dead. They don't care, whatever. That's just leave him as long as they can. And a Christian lady by the name of Irene actually went and, risked everything, risked her life to go get the body so that way there could be a proper burial. As it turns out, though, there was a problem with the burial problem. Miraculously, Sebastian is breathing still. I mean, again, hundreds of arrows, but he's still breathing, which doesn't speak well to the Roman archers. If I'm being really honest, I don't want to. Anyway, but he's still breathing somehow, and so she gets him. She takes him home and somehow removes all the arrows and painstakingly for months and months and months, nurses him back to health, knowing that if anybody ever catches her, that she's going to be treated worse than he was, that they would both obviously be executed, and she nurses him back to health. So after some period of months, it was about 5 years or so after he had joined the military to begin with, Sebastian, he's not 100%. He's not going to be joining any fights anytime soon or maybe ever again, but he's breathing and he's upright. And so Irene starts talking to him about, hey, what's next for you? Where are you going to go? Obviously, you can't stay here, and obviously you got to do something else. And, there's a lot of places for you to be. And, man, your story is crazy. Anybody all over this world, every church in this world wants you to show up and encourage them. And it's then that Sebastian informed her that he was going nowhere. Now, this is the part of the story that is very good, but also I really feel for Irene. I feel like if I was Irene, I'd be like, really? Really? You're going to do, that's your plan? I just nursed you back to health for months and risked my life, and this is your plan? Sebastian, seriously? Because Sebastian's plan was he's going to go right back into the palace. He just marches right back in. Here's the deal. This is the way Sebastian thought about this. Okay, look. All I ever wanted was to evangelize people. That's all I ever wanted to do. All I ever wanted to do was share the gospel with people. I never dreamed I would know the people I knew. I would never dream that, Diocletian, this guy, the emperor himself, sentenced me to die. That means he knows my name. That means he knows my face. We're practically besties. Well, I can't miss this opportunity. And so he knows enough people in the palace. He knows enough of the guard who would have been sympathetic to him and also thinking this man is a ghost. Also, he's invincible. Like what, he was a great soldier. He's basically back from the dead. And so they sneak him back into the palace. He sneaks his way back in. And he knows obviously he's guarded the man. So he knows where Diocletian is. He knows, what time of day it's going to be. And so you can kind of imagine the situation. They're in this giant palace, and Diocletian is just walking from one meeting to another, and out jumps Sebastian. Just surprise, here I am. And everyone was so freaked out by this. Everyone was so alarmed that he was able to preach one last sermon before anybody acted. And this time he spoke directly to Diocletian. This is what he dreamed. This is what he wanted. He wanted to make the biggest impact he could. And now he's speaking directly to the emperor. And he says, he essentially yells at him. Tells him, what are you doing, man? You're persecuting God's people. You're killing innocents. We didn't do anything to you, and this is what you're doing to us. Why are you doing that? This is going to be your legacy, man. You're going to be the king who does this. You're going to be the Roman emperor who goes down in history for this. You realize that, right? This is not going to end well for you. You can kill as many of us as you want. It's not going to go well for you. Why don't you stop? Why don't you let us live in peace? And then he makes a personal appeal. He says, why don't you see Christ for who Christ is? Why don't you repent? You've been persecuting us long enough. You've heard the gospel so many times. Why not change? Sebastian got to preach a personal sermon to the bloodiest Roman emperor in the history of the church. I believe that for him, it was the perfect way to end his life. Diocletian doesn't listen at all. He just gets mad. There's no fanfare here. They just beat him to death in that hallway. Just the guard, the people he served with. These men, his brothers in arms, beat him to death right there, and that was that. They made sure he was not breathing this time. And Diocletian does not repent. He does not become a Christian. As it turns out, Sebastian was about 20 years too soon for that. Now that's a story, huh? Here's what I'm telling it. But 100 years later, the world's very different now. Like I said, the next emperor after Diocletian is Constantine. Constantine becomes a Christian. Rome becomes not just a place where Christianity is allowed, but a place where now the official religion is Christianity. And everything looks very different now. And there's this preacher named Ambrose, and Ambrose is preaching a sermon about 100 years after the death of Sebastian. And he talks about the now Saint Sebastian. And the sermon is about Psalm 118. And Psalm 118 is a beautiful psalm. I'd encourage you guys to read it. Psalm 118 is this beautiful psalm that, in fact, actually is read traditionally by Hebrew people as they remember the Exodus. So Psalm 118 is a message of hope, a message of the end of tyranny, the message of freedom, and a message of not giving up no matter what the odds are. And Ambrose preaches this sermon about 100 years after his death and says that Saint Sebastian is exactly that guy. Saint Sebastian is the walking embodiment of not giving up. No matter the odds, no matter no matter how difficult it was, no matter the fact that he was going to die for it, no matter what, Saint Sebastian continued his work. Beautiful. About 1,000 years later, Sebastian becomes very well known. It was the 14th century, and a plague happened. We call it the Black Death now. Maybe they called it then. I don't know. It was the Black Death. 200 million people died in 7 years on this planet of this thing. This plague was not messing around. And the church is sitting around saying, what do we do? I mean, obviously, like, about the plague, nothing. There's nothing we can do. But, like, how do we hold on to any semblance of faith in a plague and the Black Death? Like, how do we hold on to anything in this world? 200 million dead people in 7 years. On a planet that I don't know how many people were here, but far fewer than 7 or 8, billion that we have. And they started telling the story of Saint Sebastian. Saint Sebastian ends up becoming one of the most famous saints. He became the saint of the plague. Because Saint Sebastian, well, he didn't give up. He joined the Roman army. I mean, he walked into the fire on purpose, and he never was changed. They tried to kill him. He still wasn't changed. And instead of walking away, he walked right back in to preach one last sermon to a man that he knew full well was never going to listen. And they started talking about Saint Sebastian, the saint of the plague. If he could do all that, then, we can keep going now. He becomes one of the most famous figures throughout the Renaissance. You look in history all the time. If you go to, like, any museum, you're going to see all sorts of paintings of a guy, tied to a tree, arrows all in him. That's Saint Sebastian. He is all over the place. I share this with you because Saint Sebastian is awesome, and I thought it was worth talking about. But also, I think Saint Sebastian is in a weird way, sort of a saint that embodies everything that Ashland Christian Church is supposed to be about. So this church began 26 years ago, and we started with essentially the Great Commission. And that Great Commission ends up, that was our thing, and we always talked about that's why we're here. And then that morphed into Connect, Call, Cultivate, which is really just a summary of the Great Commission. But it's everything we do is supposed to be the Great Commission. This is the Great Commission. Okay, it's Matthew 28, verse 19 and 20. This is what Jesus tells his disciples. He says, therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach these new disciples to obey all the commands I have given you. And be sure of this, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Cool. What does that have to do with Sebastian? Well, this is what it has to do with Sebastian. Jesus did not randomly say that to his disciples. Jesus said that to his disciples right before he was going to leave. It's funny, he says, I'll be with you all the time, and then literally disappears like 5 minutes later. I mean, like, I understand what he meant by that, but it's still kind of funny timing. Which is to say this. If ever there was a moment to quit Christianity, it was right here. Because Christianity is about Jesus, right? It's about his life. It's about his ministry. It's about, the things that he teaches. It's about the miracles he performs. It's about, it's all about that. And then it's about his death. And then it's about his resurrection. And then it's about the stuff he does after his resurrection. And it's all about Jesus. A Christianity in which Jesus is not present, walking around and doing stuff, is a Christianity that makes absolutely no sense to the people who hear the Great Commission. We're told at some point we've got probably something like 500, in 1 Corinthians, where there's like 500 people who see Jesus after his death. We also see that in the book of Acts, in chapter 1, that about 120 Christians are still waiting for the Holy Spirit to come for them to start the church. Do that math. 120 is a lot less than 500. It's like a fourth and some change. Why are those numbers so different? Well, the obvious answer is because people quit. Of course they did. Why would you not quit? I mean, if you have followed Jesus for 3 years and now Jesus is just gone, why would you not quit? Like, I was following Jesus. We're done now. It's over. I mean, even if he died on the cross, even if he rose from the dead, even if he ascended and all that stuff, even if you believe, why keep going? A Christianity without Jesus makes absolutely no sense. Jesus gives this commission as an answer to that. He tells his disciples, it's not over. Man, it hasn't even begun. This is like the prologue. I mean, you think about Jesus' ministry is 3 years. And the church has existed for almost 2,000 years since then. It's barely a footnote to a prologue of the history of the church. These people that quit did so reasonably. I mean, if you put yourself in their shoes, okay, we've seen Jesus, we know he raised from the dead, we believe in him, we do all that stuff, but why keep going if he's gone? What's the point? The point is, we don't quit. We keep going. And in this moment, when people are most likely to quit, Jesus says, I now want you guys to make disciples of all nations. I want you guys to baptize people. I want you guys to teach the world what I've taught you. And I'm going to be with you, but understand, we're talking spiritually, not physically. I'm not hanging out, we're not having food anymore. I'm not turning water into wine. You got to buy the right amount of wine next time. No more walking on water. Figure out how to sail, guys. Come on. From now on, it's you. And there seems to be clear and convincing evidence that a whole lot of people said, yeah, no, I'm out. But the people who didn't quit, those are the people who write the story. The Great Commission is a lot of things, but the Great Commission, more than anything else, is Jesus telling us never quit. Jesus telling us be like Saint Sebastian, the man who never quit, even though, boy, did it seem like he should. The fact of the matter is this, guys, there are so many reasons to quit on our faith, to quit on church, to quit on ourselves, to quit on our family, to quit. I mean, so many reasons to quit. There's always a reason to quit. It drives me crazy when people act, oh, there's no reason to quit. There's always a reason to quit. Always a reason to quit. I think a lot of people end up quitting because they've deluded themselves into thinking there's no real reasons, and then when they discover a reason to quit, then they have no other choice but to then, well, I guess there's a reason now. There are always reasons to quit. There are reasons for you to say, I'm not a Christian anymore. Always. There are reasons for you to say, I'm not going to church anymore. There's reasons for you to blow up your marriage. There's reasons for you to blow up your families. There's reasons, those reasons are real and they exist. And God has given us, through Scripture, through His Son, through church history, example after example after example to say, more than anything else, what defines a Christian is a Christian doesn't quit. I think that's a pretty good lesson for the end of 2021. And I think that's a great lesson for us to move into with 2022. I have no clue what the next year is holding. Yes, Christmas Eve, we talked about it. Man, anybody who tells you they have any clue, like if you rewind a couple years, like 2019, and say, like, oh, I know what's coming next. Nobody knew what was coming next. No one has any idea what's coming now, the next. No one has any idea. But I think what's so beautiful about a story of Saint Sebastian is this is a man who didn't quit. He had a goal. And yeah, it cost him his life. But guess what? He did what he needed to do. There was never success built into his plan. It was simply preaching. He was going to preach. There was never success built into that. And I think for us, that's such a beautiful lesson for us that, look, there's not success built into anything we do. There's not success built into there's no success promised in anything we say and do at this church or in our lives. There's never success built in. We just are called to do the right thing. And however that works out, it just works out. For us, it's about a process, not an end, right? Like, we're going to follow the right process. That's our goal. And however it lands in the end, well, that's how it lands in the end. But between now and the end, we are going to do the right thing. That's Saint Sebastian, and that's the Great Commission, and that's what we're supposed to be about. This then is our final lesson of 2021, the lesson to take into 2022. It is behind me, and it is this. To be Christian means we never quit, we never stop, and we never give up, no matter what. To be Christian means we never quit, we never stop, and we never give up, no matter what. Singers are going to come up on stage. I am also going to go up on stage. We're going to sing a song. Nobody in here needs an invitation, like you guys all know. If you guys are confused about what the invitation is, let's talk. You don't need that, though. So, we're going to go on stage. We're going to sing a song for the last time in 2021. And we are going to be people who do not quit, no matter what, as we move into 2022. As we stand.